Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're tackling a topic today that I know is going to hit home for a lot of you. Emotional immaturity, especially in the context of parent-child relationships. We're really taking a deep dive into adult children of emotionally immature parents.
Yeah.
You know from what you've shared that this is something you've encountered.
This book really gets into how these dynamics we develop early on, they really stick with us. They can affect our relationships, how we see ourselves, even how we dream. It's fascinating.
Dreams, right? It's like our subconscious going, hey, pay attention to this.
Mm.
So the book breaks down these 4 types of emotionally immature parents: driven, emotional, passive, and rejecting. But instead of getting bogged down in definitions, maybe we can focus on the driven type for a bit, especially since that porch swing analogy really resonated with you, right?
Absolutely. That story really captures it. It's like that parents trying to control the emotional temperature of the whole family. Often, they were raised in a way that didn't teach them to deal with their own emotions, so they can't really make space for anyone else's feelings either, you know?
It's like they're the only one allowed to touch the thermostat, even if everyone else is freezing or overheating. So for our listeners, think back. Have you ever felt like you were walking on eggshells around a parent? Afraid to upset this delicate balance? That could be a sign of a driven parent.
Exactly. And on top of that, emotionally immature parents, they often struggle with empathy. They have a hard time really getting and responding to their kids' emotional needs.
It's like they're speaking totally different languages when it comes to feelings. And that disconnect, man, that can be so painful when you're a kid.
Yeah, it really is. And to make it even tougher, they can be so inconsistent. One day it's all warm and engaged, the next, distant and withdrawn.
Talk about whiplash.
Huh.
And if that wasn't enough, the book also talks about how these parents, they prioritize roles over individual needs. I'm the parent, you're the child. End of story. No room for anything else.
That's it. They might even overemphasize that parent role to the point that their kid's individuality gets neglected. The child ends up feeling unseen and unheard, which is really damaging.
And that's where the real problems start, right? Because all those early experiences, unmet needs, confusing ways people interacted, they don't just vanish when we grow up.
No, they become a part of us, you know? They shape how we think about ourselves, our relationships, our whole place in the world.
Which brings us to Natalie's story from the book. That recurring dream she had, feeling totally alone even when she was surrounded by family. Man, it broke my heart reading that.
It really highlights that deep sense of emotional isolation that so many kids in these situations, they feel it. It gets to the heart of the difference between real emotional intimacy, which we all crave, and enmeshment, which can seem similar on the surface but is ultimately really suffocating.
Okay, we got to unpack that because that distinction is huge. What makes intimacy healthy and enmeshment so stifling?
You see, with emotional intimacy, it's all about individuality. It's about two people, each with their own experiences, their own perspectives, and they're choosing to connect on a deeper level. There's that mutual respect, understanding, and a real, genuine interest in the other person's inner world.
It's like I see you, you see me, and we can both appreciate the view. Yeah.
Exactly. But with enmeshment, it's more like those two people are trying to become one, blurring the lines, losing sight of where one ends and the other begins.
Like 2 vines all tangled up, instead of 2 strong trees standing side by side, each with their own roots. And the book doesn't just stop at parent-child relationships, right? It goes into how this emotional immaturity can show up in romantic relationships too.
Absolutely. It highlights how those early patterns we talked about, the low empathy, the blame, not taking responsibility, they don't just disappear when we start dating. In fact, they can get even more intense.
It's wild, right? It's like we're drawn to what feels familiar, even if it's hurtful. So it's not just about healing that relationship with mom and dad. It's about recognizing the baggage we might be bringing into all our relationships, which can feel, honestly, kind of overwhelming.
It can be, for sure. But the good news is, the book gives us some really practical advice for dealing with these complicated dynamics. It stresses how important it is to recognize red flags early on, setting good boundaries to protect ourselves, and making self-care a priority so we don't get totally drained.
Okay, recognizing red flags, that's
Yeah.
huge. But how do we actually deal with this, especially when it's our parents? We can't exactly just cut them out of our lives.
Right. It's definitely trickier than, say, a tough coworker or a friend who's always taking your energy. That's where the maturity awareness approach comes in, which the book talks about.
Okay, so what does that look like in action?
Basically, it's about shifting your focus. instead of trying to change your parents, which, let's be real, is a losing battle. It's about managing how you interact with them in a way that protects your own emotional well-being.
So it's less about fixing them and more about protecting ourselves.
Exactly, and the book breaks it down into 3 simple steps. First, expressing yourself clearly and honestly, but without expecting them to change or even agree with you.
Like, I said what I needed to say, I feel good about it, now it's up to the universe kind of thing.
You got it. The second step is to focus on what you want to get out of the conversation. What's your goal?
So like if I need mom to watch the kids, I focus on that. Not on trying to get her to understand how her emotional distance has affected me my whole life.
Exactly. Pick your battles. Right. And finally, it's about managing those interactions, not getting sucked into their drama.
Oh man, that sounds so hard. How do you do that when they're pushing all your buttons?
It takes practice, but the book gives some good techniques for staying grounded and holding those boundaries. It's like you're learning a new language, the language of emotional maturity. And sometimes it's knowing when to walk away from a conversation that's not doing you any good.
Easier said than done, for sure, but definitely a skill worth having. And you know what really brought this to life for me? Was Annie and her mother, Betty's story in the book. It showed how powerful it can be to take control of your own well-being, even if your parents are stuck in their ways.
Annie's story was really something. Even after years of emotional neglect, she found a way to make that relationship with her mom work in a way that honored her own needs, which is amazing.
And she did it without waiting for her mom to have some big change of heart or suddenly become this emotionally available parent she'd always wanted. Annie took charge, she took action, and honestly, that's so empowering. It's like she finally gave herself permission to be the grown-up, even if her mom didn't quite get there. Which is a huge takeaway for everyone, right? We can't force someone into being emotionally mature, no matter how badly we want that, especially with parents.
So true. We can't change other people. The only thing we can control is how we choose to respond.
So for our listeners sticking with us on this journey, taking it all in, what's the one thing you really want them to remember?
That they're not alone, first and foremost, and that they've got more power than they think to build healthier, more fulfilling relationships. And it all starts with being kind to yourself, acknowledging that deep down, you wanted something different with your parents.
It's easy to get stuck in that blame cycle, right? Thinking, if only I was funnier, smarter, quieter, then maybe they would have been different.
Totally. It's a common reaction to emotional immaturity, that longing for the parent you never had. The book calls it the healing fantasy, that hope that one day, poof, they'll magically transform into the parents we needed.
Like waiting for a train that's never coming. But instead of standing on that platform forever, hoping, we can choose a different path, right?
Exactly, and that starts by taking charge of our own well-being, recognizing those patterns, setting boundaries, and choosing ourselves, even when it's tough, even when it feels uncomfortable.
This deep dive has been, honestly, really insightful, but also pretty heavy. So listener, as you go about your day, here's something to think about. What's one boundary you want to set in your life, maybe even with your parents? And how can you start putting that into practice, even just a little bit today? Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep choosing yourself. Until next time, happy diving, everyone.